Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 3 cheat sheet preview. As we look towards Game Week 3, I think one of the biggest things to talk about is now that Salah in the midfield in particular has finished his game for Game Week 2, and he's sort of looking at two relatively average fixtures with the Newcastle game and then the Aston Villa game. The template, in my opinion, will probably revert back to a non-Salah structure. And I say this, and it should have impacts as well on some of the budget midfielders, which is why you'll see a lot of the categories between 4.5 to 6 million clearly aren't particularly rated by myself. And that's because I just think if you were, let's say, to wildcard today, I don't really see myself or even recommending, for example, Salah on a draft. And so that's just the sort of starting point of view. At the 4.5 position, though, we still have no changes. At 5.0, we have Enzo, who's actually a new asset. Yes, of course, he missed a penalty in the Chelsea game versus West Ham, but I like to see it as Enzo should still be the penalty taker until we get more information. Ultimately, he was 5 of 5 before. He missed his latest penalty, and I don't think managers are that quick to move off of penalty takers. There's probably a good and substantial enough reason for Enzo to be the penalty taker in the first place. And I do think that we should assume that he becomes the penalty taker until he isn't. As far as the set pieces, he's clearly on a lot of them right now, which is, of course, very beneficial for a 5.0 asset. But once again, I can't really push myself to suggest that any of the assets within these territories really make that much sense unless you're trying to sort of pursue with a solid draft. And in my opinion, there's so much money in the bank. Some of the best midfielders in this game right now are of a much cheaper price at the 6.5 to 7.5, even 8.0 territory at maximum. So there really isn't a need, in my opinion, to sort of go down to a budget midfielder when you can get so much more value if you push up a little higher. And that's why Andreas, Danjuma, and Gibbs White, they all fall. Andreas is actually a great asset. I just think that Fulham have slightly tougher games. Just came off the Brentford game, unfortunately, with a 0-3 loss. And part of that was really due to the red card. Palhinha is back, so that should help Fulham in general. But I don't think that's enough to sort of make Andreas a reasonably good pick compared to some of the other picks where you're sort of investing into an Mbeumo or a Matoma or even a March who are playing for much better offenses. And you can see that as well when you look at the underlying stats and just simply compare. The same can be said about Danjuma, even with DCL being injured. I think, of course, it's more of a concussion protocol issue. He will get this game versus Wolves, but beyond that, do you really want to be sort of sitting in your team with an Everton player or a Fulham player, or even in the situation of Gibbs White, who I would sort of describe as the key player and the focal point of this Nottingham Forest team? Is there value in a Gibbs White now that, of course, that Sheffield United game has come and gone and unfortunately is also blanked? So I've decided to sort of proactively drop all these players in these positions because I really just don't think that good template draft structures right now involve them. As far as the next sort of set of prices at the 6.5 plus players, Mbeumo, Diaby, Matoma, no changes there. I have increased March into sort of Eze's tier. I know Eze's about to hit a price drop as of the time of recording, but the beauty of March really is that he's actually getting all the expected goals, and it's because he's making great runs. He's the player who's actually hitting on the counter for this Brighton team, whereas you can see that this Brighton team operate very much out of the left-hand side. Even, for example, some of Enciso's assists in March in the previous game were coming from the left and sort of breaking down on that flank, and March is the beneficiary, effectively, that sort of last man who gets onto the ball and has actually really shown clinical finishing since he's been converted into a right winger. So historically, if you look at March, nothing really to point out with the right wing back position. But since he's actually been isolated in this right wing position, I think if you look at the numbers there so far with a small sample size, it's been very, very positive. So March is someone that is very good. Potentially, I think I was a little bit too cautious with thinking about how Adingra can actually take away the minutes of March and Matoma. I think that they're just both operating at such a great level that maybe they're still going to be starters for the time being. And really, March has the underlying stats to compete with someone like Matoma. Potentially, you can even argue he's better. I just think that Matoma will get more minutes, which is why it's actually more beneficial at times to go for someone like Matoma, who's also just a bit more creative as well. As far as Eze, I've elected not to drop him because I still think the fixtures are good in the sense that when you watch Crystal Palace play and look at how they did, even before, let's say, they went 10 versus 11, Eze was still great. Could have even drawn a penalty depending on how you interpret it as well. I just see him as such a imperious player right now that he's still going to be a good pick, even though, once again, going back to the argument of the 5.0 to 6.0 players, he's probably playing for one of the more inferior attacks with Olise out for the time being. At the 7.0 price tier, we have some changes though, and I do think Sterling is on a massive rise. I've also elected to keep Richarlison in place. The reason why I've done that with Richarlison is simply due to the fact that, yes, Spurs are going into the market and probably trying to replace Richarlison, but until that moment in time happens, the fixtures right now are very good. So Richarlison for me should start on the weekend, pending any sort of last minute transfer news. And in reality, you can think about transferring after this week, but I don't think he's a priority sell, particularly since he's sort of heading into a Bournemouth fixture. I think this is a good time to still own Richarlison, but you can think about selling if we get more additional news on transfers. As far as Sterling, though, going back to him, I think this is a perfect fixture to sort of jump on the Sterling train. If you're on any midfielders right now that you think are not really worth staying in your team, for example, you own a Havertz like myself, this could be the time to jump on someone like Sterling. I think Sterling, he looked very good in the West Ham game. Nothing really shown through the underlying stats, but you can also even argue that he could have had an expected assist of 0.75 or 0.77, which is the sort of average rate for a penalty to be scored. And so he did look relatively good from an FPL point of view, in my opinion. And I do think that, of course, Sterling, if you look historically, was a fantastic asset. I don't think that he'll reach the highs of what he was when he was a Man City player, but you're not asking for too much here when he has 3 perfect fixtures, and that's why Sterling has a rise. Conversely, Bowen has a fall. I just think that the fixtures aren't particularly good for West Ham. And ultimately, I think when we look at something like talisman theory and also just underlying stats, Bowen is, of course, he was a key player, scored the key goal within the European final, but it's very evident that he doesn't get as many chances as some of the other leading picks within these sort of price points, particularly when the fixtures aren't elite. And so for this reason, I think I have to drop Bowen as well. And Antony and Trossard, they're just both avoids right now. I just think there's not enough being done with this United team to really value going for one of their third or fourth best midfield picks right now. It's already quite hard to even argue, let's say, keeping Fernandes and Rashford in the positions that they are. But personally, I think I will talk about Rashford and Fernandes in a moment, but Antony is still always going to be a third or fourth option in this team, just in terms of how it even bears out in underlying stats. That's very clear. As far as the 7.5 plus players, I've given Foden a rise in the previous week, so nothing really changes there. We anticipated, of course, that with KDB being out, that Foden would be a fantastic pick, and look, it bore out perfectly in terms of that game week 2 fixture versus Newcastle, which was still an incredibly tough game, but one where I still saw Foden being a deserved rise, and I'm very happy with the sort of decision to do that. With Maddison, he just seems like he'll miss out the game week 3 game based on the Paul O'Keefe tweet. Effectively, he has a short-term injury, and it's probably going to be a precautionary move from the Spurs management to actually bench him for game week 3. So I don't see him playing game week 3, and even if he does, maybe he comes on as a substitute, which I think is also rather unlikely. At this point in time, Maddison's a good pick. You might even think about moving to him in game weeks 4 and 5 instead, and just sort of holding caution. That's why the asterisk is on Maddison. As far as Grealish, I've given him a rise, and I think part of that is because even though Doku's coming in, he's still probably the person that would get that left wing position going forwards. Not too many people outside of Foden and Alvarez could arguably play there. Some people might even be concerned about why I'm saying Alvarez can play there. He played there actually when KDB was injured, and Grealish didn't start that game, so Alvarez actually moved towards the left. Actually played relatively decent in that position. So we can now say that with the City structure change as well, particularly with how it's impacted their defense and also just the shape of the team now that Stones is out, they do look quite good. And actually a couple people are now occupying the same positions that Grealish used to solely dominate. But that still isn't under huge threat. But I think his starting position is still not under massive threat right now. So for this reason, I think Grealish is still worthy of a rise because the fixtures right now are just perfect. The Newcastle fixture is gone. He's very likely to still start some games because he's very fit as a player as well at a young age, where it's not like someone like Bernardo Silva where you start to see him like Mahrez, for example, eventually progress to just playing exclusively European games. He's still fit enough to play in the domestic PL game. So I think Grealish is a good pick to go for. The underlying stats aren't fantastic, and that's the biggest problem for me. Of course, unfortunately, since moving from Aston Villa, Grealish hasn't looked particularly good as an FPL pick. And that's sort of what you're dealing with now. I think, of course, because Foden's just sitting there, blank in the face, it's very hard to go for Grealish, but they're both going to be good picks because the run is good. As far as Havertz, he gets another fall. I mean, I own Havertz. It's hard to sort of justify continue owning him. But I also think that this is his true best fixture. You probably want to give Havertz this fixture if you are a more patient manager like myself potentially. And that's all I really have to say about Havertz. You have Jesus probably expected to come back this week or the week after in terms of getting back into training and then actually getting a starting position by, let's say, game weeks 4/5, because there's also a sort of break in between. And that's what I have to think about Havertz. Ultimately, the punt is over after the Fulham game, and after that, he's not really going to be a serious pick again for the time being, because we've got some Chelsea and City players that are very viable at this point in time. Even Eze, for example, where the fixtures will actually look much better by game week 4. So he's someone where we probably have to sort of reorientate our heads around and think we have to go back into him. As far as someone like Diaz, I haven't give him another rise, and that's simply because I do think that the next two fixtures are tough. Yes, I can understand people who went for the punt, going for the Bournemouth game, and of course, plaudits to you for going for that. I think I even admitted that Diogo Jota was probably my favorite captaincy if you really wanted to do a midfield punt pick, and he turned out really good as well. So with the Liverpool midfield, that's all I'll really say. I think Jota has great underlying stats. Unfortunately, poor minutes because he still is rotating. As far as Diaz, much more nailed, but slightly poorer underlying stats. And even though he's looked much more advanced and occupied some much better positions, with Salah potentially even losing out, arguably, I'd still say that Diaz is someone I'd probably avoid until the fixtures become a lot better. And we know that Liverpool have a much better fixture swing around, let's say, game week 9 onwards. So that's when I'd really seriously consider Diaz in my team. As far as someone like Martinelli, I've cautiously given him a drop as well. I think it is the time to drop him. I just think he doesn't get enough minutes compared to, let's say, Odegaard and Saka, where now we've got this sort of doubt in between the two players where they could both be penalty takers, I guess, depending on what Saka feels, just based on what Odegaard has said about it. So it does appear to me as a situation where Martinelli is the odd one out now, very much like Havertz, but of course Havertz a little bit worse as a pick. And Trossard can also come in too. We saw an early substitution for Martinelli because of game state, really just due to the red card. And I don't think that's going to change too much, but that's sort of my opinion on Martinelli for the time being. And then actually in terms of the premium price there, I've not made any changes with exception to actually increasing Son. The reason why I've increased Son is because I still think that there's a chance that he'll get penalties. And the fixture run is also really good for Spurs. So now that they've actually come and gone through game weeks 1 and 2, I would say that Son is very comparable to an option like Rashford. In fact, I'd probably consider dropping Rashford next week after this Nottingham Forest game. The one thing that I have sort of done here in terms of keeping Fernandes and Rashford, despite them being relatively poor, is because Fernandes actually looked exceptional still in the previous game versus Spurs. So I think you can say that all the things that we love about FPL in terms of looking at underlying stats, making sure that players are still doing good work before they're getting FPL points, is there with Fernandes. And Rashford, clearly that's not the case, but he's had big chances simply because he's so good at running off a loose ball. But at the central forward position, he's not getting the same opportunities to do that. And playing with his back to goal sometimes, that's incredibly difficult, I think, for someone with his attributes. He's much better suited to playing left forward. And so you have to sort of say that Rashford makes the most sense in terms of keeping for the Nottingham Forest game. But then actually you can maybe reconsider whether you want to go for Rashford, just depending on, let's say, whether Højlund comes back into the team and whether he's actually able to sort of push Rashford back in that left wing position. Because ultimately both Garnacho and Sancho have really struggled to sort of hold that position down. They've both been pretty pathetic, to be quite honest. And I suppose the one asterisk as well is also with the Mount injury for game weeks 3 and 4. You could argue that Man United reverting back to the structure where they have Eriksen, Casemiro, and Fernandes could actually be much more beneficial for both these two players because they were playing so much better in the previous year with a structure without Mount. And maybe it's not Mount's fault, but maybe the implementation so far has been really, really dire. So it's quite nice actually to see that Mount is out. Hopefully you just get a little bit of reversion to what we saw last year, which was actually quite effective for United versus some of the weaker teams like a Nottingham Forest. So that's why I've done that. As far as Salah, as I said, because of the structural changes in FPL and because the fixtures aren't particularly good for Salah now, you don't really see too many captaincies in the short term for Salah as well. I've actually dropped him. I just think that he's a little bit overpriced right now for this run. Until game weeks, let's say 8 or 9, we can probably revisit Salah. But until then, he's going to be a yellow asset. And that's sort of the big change within the midfield position for the time being. As far as the forward position, there haven't been too many changes. I've added Semenyo as a 4.5. We had a lot of murmurs about Archer moving, about Balogun moving. We haven't really had any updates there. Mubama also doesn't really seem like he's going to knock down a position because Antonio's also back in the team. Semenyo, however, is actually starting for Bournemouth. And we know with the new manager that that's actually quite a big benefit too when you have, let's say, a young player getting an opportunity to actually get good minutes. So I think at 4.5, he's actually become the best pick just by default, just because he's now playing. We know that he's also playing for a rather competent manager, even though we don't expect too much out of Bournemouth. And so that's quite valuable. As far as the 5.0 players, no changes here with Adebayo. 5.5, though, we have no changes once again. However, Nketiah has become a differential. I just think that the time to go for Nketiah is a little bit too short now. Yes, he's gotten 2 returns from the previous games, but I think with Jesus coming back very shortly, and a lot of us are really locked into a triple Arsenal template, it's very hard to see ourselves moving towards Nketiah. It's also a source of inflexibility too, because let's say if you want to keep some of your Arsenal assets, it's very hard to do so if you go for Nketiah, because you'd probably have to push towards Jesus and therefore downgrade in some other positions, which doesn't feel very, very nice at this point in time. So he just remains as the differential. As far as the 6.0 picks, no changes other than adding Awani. Him actually being benched in game week 1 was a bit of a concern. I didn't really want to recommend him as a pick immediately, even though he had a really good game versus Sheffield United. Ultimately, though, now that he's starting again, I think this is a huge benefit. And when the fixtures maybe turn for Nottingham Forest, we can consider Awani, but Wisa is literally staring us right in the face at 6.0. He's such a good pick. I would definitely think about him if you were, let's say, a little bit more cash strapped and you were wanting to move out of João Pedro. And as far as Alvarez, I also think that he's a fantastic pick too. Yes, of course, Doku's coming in, but we know traditionally with Pep, it takes time to integrate a player. I think a player as raw as Doku as well will probably struggle to actually find his way towards the team. A manager who wants control a lot of the times is probably going to be a little bit at odds with Doku with him being as raw as he is at this moment in time. So Alvarez for me is a very good pick. He can actually still play some of the wing positions as we've seen, as I've explained as well with the KDB situation. And of course, he can even fill in some excess minutes when Haaland gets subbed off early. So that's a huge plus for Alvarez when you're sort of mapping a minefield of what the Man City midfielder minutes are, or even the forward minutes are. Alvarez really does stand to gain a lot from KDB being out and the lack of depth right now, especially with, let's say, Bernardo Silva. If he's, let's say, still nursing that injury coming back into the training, he doesn't need to be rushed for the Sheffield United game. So this could be, once again, a great opportunity for Alvarez to get another outing. As far as the 7.5 category, no changes there and no changes with the 7.0 as well. I just think Jackson's a fantastic pick. This is the time to go for him right now with the Luton fixture if you haven't jumped on him already. As far as 7.5, I can kind of understand the appeal of going for Isak. Yes, the City game is come and gone. That's the worst fixture possible in terms of how good the defensive City is. Right now, when you look forwards and forecast into fixtures, of course, Liverpool was a very tough fixture for Newcastle last season. So you can say from a head-to-head sort of matchup point of view, it's quite tough. But beyond that, really, and just simply just looking at Liverpool so far, I think Isak stands to be a very good pick. The biggest asterisk with Isak still is going to be what is going on with Wilson. What is the sort of permanent position of Isak within the team? Are we going to see things like last season where suddenly Wilson will get a run of starts when he's fully fit? And that's my only concern with Isak. Otherwise, he's a very, very good pick with just slight X-Men's concerns. As far as the Liverpool assets, I've decided to drop Gakpo as well. He's playing at the midfield at times. He gets probably more minutes than we would expect, but the underlying stats, as I said, are very, very poor. At the forward position as well, you really want to see extremely high XG, which he doesn't really get given the position that he plays. And Jurgen still loves playing him, but clearly not at positions where he's going to benefit from him as an FPL pick. As far as the 8.0 players, I've also dropped Watkins. That's not really in reaction to, let's say, him losing penalties, but it's more in reaction to just the fixtures turning. I'd say this is a great time to jump on some players that are much cheaper and would actually probably enable you to, let's say, strengthen your midfield and defense if you've had any issues with them so far, such as addressing issues within the defense or addressing, of course, some picks who've blanked so far within the midfield. And so for this reason, I think Watkins does get a fall. The long-term ramifications of him losing penalties, I would say, is still a net negative for Watkins in terms of how we value him as a pick, even though he's such a bad penalty taker, and he's actually missed more than 50% of his official penalties in his lifetime. So that's sort of how I feel about Watkins. Ultimately, not much has changed really with the penalty situation, but the fixtures aren't particularly great going forwards compared to some of the really good fixtures that some of the cheaper assets have. And that's sort of the landscape of the forwards right now. As far as the defense this week, I have not many changes once again. I think the midfield, of course, was the biggest source of changes. A lot of movement, of course, as we expect for United and Arsenal assets to sort of move out and not be as great as they sort of hit head-to-head in Game Week 4. As far as the 4.0 picks, though, I've added Gusto as a new top-tier asset. I think you have to sort of add an asterisk to Gusto and understand that he's a short-term punt. James could be back in the team with Game Week 5. We know that he's sort of only got a short-term injury, and we heard from Pochettino, rather, that it's only going to be a few weeks at best. And so I would say with Gusto, you're really looking at him having a really good game versus West Ham. So it's very likely as well that he'll get the 2 fixtures whilst James is out, in terms of the Luton fixture and then that Nottingham Forest fixture. So I think because those fixtures are so good back to back, and because we don't really expect too much value from the 4.0s, this is a great time to go there. I've also removed Baldock because of the injury. Not exactly sure whether we'll get an update on that, but ultimately it's not really a time to really consider Baldock anyways. Kabore has been re-added to the cheat sheet. I think with Kabore, you're probably hoping that Luton will get a double game week soon, but he becomes a very interesting pick if you can actually move towards him. And if we get any hint of news that Luton Town will have an early double game week, which I think is rather unlikely at this point in time. As far as, let's say, Kabore and Bear, I mean, I don't think there's too much really in between them. I think Burnley will be a much better defense, but you can see that Kabore, even when just that one game week in game week 1 versus Brighton, that they actually look like a relatively good attack, and actually someone like Kabore will be highly utilized from the attacking point of view. So that could really offset, let's say, how poor we think the Luton Town defense will be. But that's all I have to say on the 4.0s. At 4.5, I've reinserted Colwell back into the top tier. I think I was a bit cautious in terms of reacting to him because of how good James looked as a pick for Game Week 1 and actually just forecasting into the future. But with James being injured and now actually the great run of games being games that he will miss, Colwell is actually someone that I would say I have much more faith in as a pick right now. He's also occupying effectively a left back position. So if you look at heat maps for Colwell, very, very good for a 4.5 pick that we were simply thinking would just be a left center back. Right now, Chilwell is effectively the left winger of the team. Even though Chilwell got subbed off at 60 minutes, you're continuing to see Colwell play, and he has the faith of the manager, I would say. So very huge buff to Colwell as a pick and his viability for the next 3 game weeks. All these assets here are fantastic, though. Udogie has really good interest, and in my opinion, is because he covers game weeks 4 and 5, which are very tough for a lot of teams as well, where United have bad fixtures, particularly if we own a United defender. And of course, we know United and Arsenal defenders just struggle in game week 4 because of the mirror matchup. As far as Henry, similar sort of thing here, where he also covers game week 4 really, really well. Game week 5, tougher game versus Newcastle, so that's a different situation there. And then Botman, I just think, as I've been saying for the whole season, when you have access to a defender who's nailed within the second best defense within the league, it's very hard to pass up on that. And he has a lot of value as a bench piece for us right now. So that's why he stays there. With Tarkowski, good fixtures now. With Pau, tougher fixtures, but probably a defense that would be really good for the time being. And you can probably continue to rotate someone like Pau and Botman in the future and just sort of look at the long-term value of them as well. So similar sort of changes there. No changes really in the 4.5 position. I still see it as a depth position. You should not be trying to, let's say, start a singular 4.5 pick week to week. But if you can find it, let's say, nice rotation pattern between the two of them, or a 4.5 and let's say a 5.0, and there's some gaps that a 4.5 can fill, that's what a 4.5 should be doing for your FPL teams right now. At 5.0, I've added Zinchenko to the cheat sheet. I've also dropped Gabriel, unfortunately. He does deserve a drop. I think even though Arteta has said that Gabriel will play a lot of games, the reality is he's been benched 2 games in a row. The second game was a bit of a shock to me. I was not expecting, particularly with Zinchenko actually being fit, that Gabriel would be benched once again. Potentially now with the Tomiyasu red card, we'll see Gabriel play, but I can understand people moving away from Gabriel to avoid further price drops as well with such an asset. So I've dropped Gabriel. Akanji was someone that I actually had in the cheat sheet last week, and I think he does deserve to be within the sort of consideration of people looking for another City pick. In fact, I would rate him over Walker and Guardiola simply because I think he covers much more positions. We've seen much more positional flexibility from him as a pick. And if you really want to avoid, let's say, paying up the full amount of money for Ruben Diaz, then Akanji is your man. And he will get a lot of good minutes with Stones being out up until effectively game week 4. Or 5 rather. As far as the 5.5 plus picks, no changes here really other than just reacting towards the James and Stones injuries and their sort of time frames. We know that they're both likely to be back by game weeks 5/6. That's quite a long amount of time if you actually look at the weeks from let's say this point in time. But still, nothing to really consider about these two picks. I also think with James, by the time he comes back, we're not going to be that deeply invested into wanting to get double Chelsea fullbacks. And if we already have Chilwell on our team, that's really us covered. As far as 6.5 to 8.0 picks, the premiums here, I've actually added a rise for Trippier and then a fall for Trent. I just think it's deserved because Liverpool continue to look like a rather poor defense. At 8.0, it's just an absolute killing to sort of go for Trent. As far as Trippier, continues to look really good. I think he still looked relatively good in the City game. Continues to be a huge set piece threat, which is, of course, one of the biggest traits that he has going forwards. And given the sort of access to a Newcastle defender game week 5 onwards, I just think Trippier is definitely going to be someone that we're going to be gearing towards very, very shortly. And he'll easily become a best pick, even though he's more expensive than some of the other picks within these territories. Outside of Chilwell, I would say he's the only, and even Estupiñán, of course, despite Brighton being a rather poor defense, at least from what we've seen early signs, I would say Trippier is still a vastly underpriced asset, considering what he brings to the offensive side of the table, just simply because he's also equally covered with how good Newcastle are as a defense. And then moving on towards the goalkeepers this week, no changes for me whatsoever. I think we made some good changes towards the goalkeepers last week. The only change, actually, sorry, that I've made is to rise Ederson again. I think I was overcautious with reacting to the Sam Lee news about how within City management that they've considered internally about whether Ortega would start. I was wrong on that, so I have to kind of hold my hands up there. I was someone who wanted to go Ederson. If you sort of saw my early drafts as well at FPL, I'm quite sad to have missed on him. That's sort of 10 points in the bin, effectively, or rather 8 points, but that's just the way things go in FPL. And so I think Ederson continues to remain as a good pick. This City team, particularly in the structure that they're sort of playing in right now, they've completely starved out their opposition. The XG conceded is absolutely minimal, and this is the right time to own City defenders. So that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.